The stone in Europe's shoe is gone. Viktor Orban was, for most of his 16 years, the EU's worst nightmare and Vladimir Putin's best friend. Now, Hungary has utterly banished him and embraced Peter Magyar, and the sigh of relief right across Europe is loud and clear. But is Hungary's new leader necessarily Europe's dream boy and Ukraine's salvation rolled into one? Here's what he said about Hungary's future role in the EU.
Perhaps one of the most important things people decided was Hungary's place in Europe, whatever the outgoing current corrupt government thought. No matter how hard the outgoing government tried to pull Hungary out of the EU, 23 years to the day after the referendum on Hungary's accession to the European Union. The people reasserted our European and EU membership.
All right, let's talk about Hungary's new leader with Maria Snegovaya, a senior fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Maria, you've been watching this election closely, this country and region closely as well. What do you think the world least understands, perhaps, about this changeover of power in Hungary?
In my opinion, I think the fascinating thing about this transition is that Peter Magyar himself is a former Fidesz member, and in a lot of ways he's an elite insider to the regime. I think his success to a large extent owns to the fact that he is a better, less corrupt, younger version of Viktor Orban, who appeals to the relatively socially conservative Hungarian population with a similar offering. In fact, he criticized Orban for his insufficiently tough stances on immigration, for example. So from that perspective, we are seeing far-right party, maybe politics replaced with right-wing centrist politics of the kind that we've seen maybe in Poland. But that means that the change that many anticipate to happen in Hungarian politics may not be as radical and dramatic as many expect, because I imagine that Peter Magyar, and one of the reasons why he was so successful is his ability to split the elites. It means that he probably promised certain future for some of the Fidesz insiders going forward.
Perfect stepping off point. So let's take a look at what we do know and what we think we understand about the agenda of Peter Magyar. As you say, he outlined some of his key domestic and international policies at a 3-hour press conference in Budapest. Magyar said securing frozen EU funds is his government's top priority, talking about 17 billion euros. He said his government would evaluate joining the Eurozone. He called Russia a security risk for Europe. Where Magyar doesn't differ from Orban, and you talked a little about this, Maria, is his opposition to migration. He said he will not accept any EU migration pact or allocation mechanism. That's just as a starting point. I want to talk about the 17 billion in EU funding as a starting point for us, Maria. That's the line that stands out. It was a pretty big carrot, presumably, for the incoming Prime Minister. What does he have to do to secure that EU money? Is that a foregone conclusion that they get that now?
Well, as a matter of fact, the EU has just told us about 27 points for Peter Magyar to fulfill before he gets to his promised EU funding available. By the way, it has to be mentioned that the EU has refrained of taking this strict action of freezing the funds for Hungary until late 2022. But once it did, it ultimately delivered the blow to the Orban regime, just because it was to a large extent, the economic situation and the fact that Hungary fell behind the EU average on economic growth that really did the trick to a large extent. And so for Peter Magyar, of course, releasing these funds is highly important because Hungary's economic situation leaves much to be desired. And he does have to satisfy a number of conditions, including altering the rule of law situation, corruption, and also, of course, Hungary's position on Ukraine, which also Orban consistently put multiple obstacles for EU's ability to push forward its security agenda. So from that perspective, it's definitely good news. It leaves, I think, zero doubt that Peter Magyar will be much more consensual, agreeable person in terms of negotiating with the EU on these issues.
Yeah, everything on the agenda and a little of what you've talked about makes him sound a lot like a model EU citizen in waiting. Is it that simple?
Well, it's never as simple, and fundamentally, one has to flag, right, that the emergence of Viktor Orban and his ability to sustain 16-year rule is partly owns to broader frustration of Hungarian citizens with the EU. There was a lot of frustration with the way the transition occurred, disappearance of the manufacturing in traditional industrial hubs of Hungary. And also, final blow was delivered by the 2008 financial crisis, where essentially people felt that the country was not prescribed the right treatment. And Orban tried to offer an alternative that also did not deliver. But as we can see, the Hungarian electorate remains quite conservative and right-wing. And it's probably likely that Peter Magyar will try to strike this middle ground, the third way, between like full embrace of the EU prescriptions, or this alternative liberal democratic pattern that Orban has provided and they did not deliver. But what it means in terms of, for example, Chinese investments into Hungary, and just a reminder that Hungary has become the largest recipient of the Chinese investment in the EU. Also, Russian penetration, right? Because the energy dependence will not go away. Peter announced that it will very gradually diversify away from Russian energy until 2035, so almost 10 years. So all of that remains leaves a lot of questions unanswered, even if, as I said before, nonetheless, it's clear that it's great news for Ukraine in general.
Maria, I want to show you one more thing. DW senior international correspondent Fanny Fashar in Budapest asked Magyar some questions during his marathon press conference, including one about Hungary's relationship with Germany.
You have just underlined how important it is to forge close ties with European leaders. What will the relationship look like between Hungary and Germany? What kind of relationship would you like to build with Germany's Chancellor, Mr. Merz? Thank you very much.
Germany is Hungary's most important partner. We have a very close historical and cultural relationship. Many Hungarian people work there. Germany is Hungary's most important investor. I look forward to working with Germany. Personally, I would like to be on good terms. I studied in Hamburg. I love that city, and I love Germany very much. I would like to be on good terms with Germany. But I have forgotten nearly all my German because I never had a chance to practice this beautiful language.
There might be a point of contention there about it being a beautiful language, but he was still speaking Deutsch, and it was an important olive branch in the eyes of many people. I wonder if you think Germany and Hungary will get along now that both countries will be governed by pro-European centre-right leaders, or is this a relationship you think that won't be fixed anytime soon?
Well, it's definitely going to be much better than anything that we've seen under Orban, and I think the desire to get those funds, EU funds, unfrozen at least early on, will definitely push Peter Magyar towards a more agreeable stance. He already announced, for example, that he will not put obstacles to this loan for Ukraine, which was previously vetoed by Orban. So for all of that is really great news. There are, however, as I said before, these fundamental issues that to what extent Peter Magyar will be able to fundamentally dismantle the system that Orban built. And I think that's a really interesting question for many of us to look at, trace carefully going forward. I will flag that in Poland we had a similar situation when Law Justice lost the election, was replaced by more centrist right-wing party, Civic Platform. But because for the lack of necessary tools and significant, maybe even seats, the new coalition and the new government was unable to fundamentally alter some of the changes that were introduced by the populist government, which led to more frustration of the electorates, them being unwilling to take the radical steps, but those radical steps would have been in violation of the institutional arrangement, so that would have made them also would have put them in the wrong position. I wonder if Peter Magyar will be sort of facing similar situation, but he does have 2/3 majority. So for him, the situation is much easier. He definitely has a mandate from the population to try and push forward the change. Ultimately, it's up to him to what extent how far he's willing to go. I will flag that his insider status to the system makes the situation very, very interesting. I do work on elite continuity, specifically in my case, I work on post-Soviet elite continuity, and I do find in my research that the stronger the elites ties to the previous regime, the less far they're willing to push the reforms. So it will be a very interesting test for the theory in case of Hungary now.
Yeah, very much so. We should also look at how Hungarians, the people who gave him this mandate that you're talking about, on the ground, Hungarians, how they reacted to these election results, Maria. Here's some of what voters in Budapest had to say on the day after Magyar's victory.
I feel very happy. I have been waiting for 16 years this morning to beat Mr. Orbán. He had a illiberal system which was against our fundamentals. We are Europeans and we want to stay in Europe.
That means for me the freedom, finally the direction we wanted.
I'm very happy.
I don't like it. I would have preferred Orbán stayed. The one some teaser only promise but give nothing. And I don't know what will happen.
I'm very disappointed. It shouldn't have gone this way. I would have wanted Fidesz. I supported it and also voted for it.
I'm very happy now because I think it's the beginning of something new, and I'm very excited about what's the next step. And but I'm full with hope because I think this is what we wanted.
All right, so we've heard from both sides of the aisle there, as it were, in terms of voting, Maria. The election outcome was, though, absolutely conclusive, to the point where there was no point for Orbán to go through with any denial of the results, should we say. But the hard-right voters that had underwritten his government that you talked about of 16 years, they won't disappear entirely, just as in Germany with the AfD. I wonder, though, has Magyar written any sort of playbook here for defeating the hard right?
That's a fascinating question. And by the way, good news for all political scientists in the world, in that in a lot of ways, this election was a test for how democratic Hungarian system really is. The VDM, one of the most reputable institutes that ranks democracy, actually qualified Hungary as electoral autocracy since 2018. But the fact that the election took place in relatively clean fashion, and Orbán conceded so fast, literally 3 hours after the electoral precincts closed, really points toward good news for Hungary, that the electoral manipulation definitely took place, but ultimately the electoral system was not as corrupt as one could have anticipated. But of course, first of all, in the interviews, you can clearly see the divides within the Hungarian society. That it's interesting that they came through. For example, younger people more in support of the change, and older people more likely to embrace Orbán. There's also urban-rural divide, even if Peter Magyar sort of healed it somewhat. But clearly, in terms of the playbook, one thing I will flag is that in the past, some of the failures of Hungarian opposition had to do with the fact that they tried to offer an alternative on the left side of the political spectrum, probably embrace ideas that for much of the Hungarian population have been discredited for the reasons I described before. And also some of the older elite members would not leave for quite some time, which also sort of was not popular within the Hungarian electorate. The key attraction of Peter Magyar is that he is young, relatively untarnished by corruption accusations. He grew as an opposition voice to Orbán against this huge scandal about pedophilia in orphanage in Hungary, and sort of presented himself as a much more true family value-oriented alternative to Orban. But at the same time, he sort of caters to the same groups that are fundamentally somewhat conservative. I think it's also a lesson for Brussels in some ways. You know, some countries in the EU just not necessarily always ready to embrace all the radical changes that the EU has been promoting. And in that sense, you see that Hungarian population, for example, remains quite conservative at its core, but it is willing to accept a more moderated version, right, more pro-EU version, as long as sort of the compromise can be found. So perhaps try to find an novel alternative. Do not stick to all the politicians. Try to understand what the actual preferences of the electorate are and to what extent they are compatible with some moderated pro-EU version. I'm confident that it is possible to find. And last point I want to flag, this popular opinion is sometimes in the scholarship is that populist voters are authoritarians, right? They don't like democracy and they want to reject these institutions of democracy. As we see, and very clearly in Hungarian elections, that is not fully true. They might be necessarily not always supportive of liberal institutions, unfortunately sometimes violate minority rights, and that certainly is a problem. But as you can tell, fundamentally, even supporters of populist parties ultimately embrace democracy at its core. In fact, Hungary and Poland are some of the most supportive of democracy European EU countries, and they do stand for their electoral institutions. So one of the reasons why Orban conceded so fast is because according to the polls, Fidesz supporters were not willing to back an alternative claim, right? They were willing to accept electoral outcomes. That is great news for Hungary. That is great news for EU going forward and for democracy in general.
Yeah, and it leads us inextricably back to Washington, I guess, in many ways. You talk about the lessons for Brussels. I want to talk about the reaction where you are, as it being interesting to this as well. I was waiting for Donald Trump to acknowledge the victory, but it never came. Any news on that front, what he thinks?
Well, the Trump administration has officially postulated support of friendly parties in Europe in its national security strategy that came out late last year. And they did remain true to that claim. Indeed, we've seen representative members of Trump administration, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, travel to Hungary and support Viktor Orban. We know that there is multiple connections for various platforms, right-wing platforms that they have in common, the MAGA and the MAGA movement and Orban. Having said that, the good news here is that Peter Magyar is also a right-wing conservative politician, right? So he fundamentally embraces many of the same values that the Trump administration also supports. So I would flag that for that reason, I do not think that the US really cared that much ultimately as to who were to win. And potentially for Peter Magyar, it's an opportunity really to try to find this approach that would make him acceptable to both, the Trump administration and the EU, and hopefully seal some of the divides that unfortunately we have witnessed between the US and Europe in the last year.
Yeah, in terms of Hungary's support, let's go to the other side of the other point in this triangle and finish with Russia. What does this result mean for Russia? Is this a really significant blow for Vladimir Putin?
It is a significant blow. If there's one big loser of this election second to Viktor Orban, it's definitely Vladimir Putin. We have seen that, first of all, Russia has been really a stronghold, Hungary has been a stronghold of Russian political influence in the European Union for quite some time. Viktor Orban has repeatedly traveled, met with Putin 15 times total and 4 times after 2022. And unlike the rest of the European Union, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Hungary increased dramatically its energy dependence on Russia, while the rest of the European Union actually tried to decouple from the Russian energy. So Russian leverage kept increasing. There's multiple spy-related accusations. Russian spies use Hungary as a hub. There is also all sorts of corrupt deals potentially going through certain banks like OTP Bank. And we know also that the EU officials in private conversations mentioned that they try not to discuss some of the sensitive security-related matters when some of the members of the Orban government were present. As such, so high was the penetration of Russian spies or intelligence, which of course is a huge problem given that Russia represents a really existential threat to the European Union at this point. Putin fought hard to keep Orban in power. There was an entire, group of influences delegated by Russia's presidential administration to Hungary prior to the election. They even allegedly considered staging a coup or creating disinformation about an assassination attempt against Viktor Orban in an effort to boost his support. There may or may not have been a false flag operation in Serbia, again, in an effort to boost support for Orban. But altogether, none of that worked. All of that failed dramatically, given that Peter Magyar won in a landslide with a two-thirds majority. And it's not the first time Russia fails in Moldova. Last year, we have seen quite the same situation with the same political influences in Russia failing as badly to secure support for their candidate. I think that's great news. In a lot of ways, Russia has lost its leverage it previously had. We do know and anticipate Russia's corrupt and negative influence on the European Union, and to some extent the electorates in the European countries seems to understand the dangers that are really coming from Russia. And Peter Magyar has repeatedly promised to look into this various corruption and spy scandals connected to Russia, and hopefully with his help, this will be one problem that will be somewhat at least addressed and will start taunting the EU security policy.
An absolutely fascinating moment for Hungary and the region, the EU, on so many fronts. Maria Snegovaya, it's been fascinating to get your insights. Senior Fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, one more question to go. What do you think will Magyar turn out to be? The loyal ally the EU has been looking for? And what would that mean for Hungarians? Time for you to have your say as we say goodbye.